Buried behind me in the town of Kingston, Georgia, are 249 unknown Confederate dead, men who succumbed to wounds received at the battles of Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, and at the Kingston-Dalton campaign, which was actually waged in the hills around me. In fact, if you look just down the hill here, you can see a memorial, more recently, to the Confederate dead from the local community. Now, in May of 1864, the men who were wounded in the early Atlanta campaign, who were scattered around hospitals in the local area, were moved to the city of Atlanta, which Confederate authorities believed was safe. Now, to his credit, Sherman did not burn the hospitals, but many men died of just ill health in these horrible living conditions because very little was known about modern sanitation, and most of those men were eventually brought back to the Kingston Cemetery here or other cemeteries in the local area. And there are 249, but all around me, in the hills of West Georgia, you have thousands of Confederate graves, many of which died in the battles around Atlanta. After the war, a wayside home for Confederate veterans was actually established in Kingston, and there's a very interesting monument to it right out in front of the 250 unknown Confederate soldiers. And also kind of interesting is, this was an early pioneer town in West Georgia, and you can see here a Revolutionary soldier and Minuteman, James Gaines, or actually Richard Gaines, who the Gaines family were early settlers of this part of the state. And you can see the hill offered a commanding view of Georgia. In the same cemetery in Kingston is the grave of Mary Goulding, who was a minister to both sides in the Civil War. She helped soldiers in the wayside homes and in the hospitals, and her original grave is right here. You can see that over the years it's been cracked and chipped, but she seems like a good woman. In the shadow of the Confederate war graves of Kingston, Georgia, is the grave of Melvinius Shields, the great-great-great-grandmother of First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama. And it's very fascinating because she was born into slavery in 1844 at a plantation in South Carolina before being moved as a very young girl to Rex, Georgia. After the end of slavery and the Civil War, she made her way up to Kingston to be closer to her people. This is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And because of this, she came to be buried here, and it was only in very recent times that she was given a grave of her own. A fascinating story from oppression to First Lady of the United States. Something that always struck me as sad about the burials in the Deep South is how segregated they were. This is Michelle Obama's great-great-great-grandmother, and she's buried in the cemetery of the African Methodist Episcopal Church right here behind me. And she would have been buried in the middle of a field of other burials, but most of these folks could only afford simple wooden crosses. Of course, Melvinia was given a much larger memorial because of her relation to the First Lady of the United States. By the way, this is the AME Church. But the white residents of town could afford to be buried on a much better plot of land with nice headstones. And these burials continued up until relatively recently with just wooden markers that would rot away over time and quickly be forgotten. I'm here in Springbank, Georgia, trying to find an old Confederate cemetery not too far away. Some of the battles fought around here would have been very intense, and I found this near the Double J Farms, what looks like the ruins of an old mill. And you can see now I'm walking on the railroad tracks, which might indicate these railroads were here at the time of the Civil War. And as I pan over here, you can see another set of ruins right along the creek and railroad. And I'm not sure what role these played in the Civil War, but they might have been something. And Springbank actually seems to be an old ghost town that used to be right next to the town of Kingston, which I'm going to next to see the Confederate cemetery. And they called it Spring Bank because there's a sort of embankment here, and the waters are beautiful blue coming from a spring underground near here.